In this two-part video, we'll take a look at how pilots flying small aircraft under visual flight rules, and that's about 97% of the pilot community flying little airplanes, navigate using today's technology. Here's how we used to do it in the 20th century. We draw our track on a paper chart from a set course point near our departure airport to our destination and put distance ticks every 10 miles. Here I've chosen the city of Pembroke as my set course point. When we crossed it, we'd start a timer. Then we'd fly along that line for a few miles until we came to an unmistakable point. Here I've chosen an island and bend in the Ottawa River. At that point, the distance ticks say we'll have flown 15 miles from our set course point. We can also measure the distance from Pembroke to our destination from the chart. It's 67 miles. When we cross the river, we'll stop the timer. It says 5 minutes 45 seconds. Then we'd reach for our circular slide rule, a real piece of 20th century technology, also known as a whiz wheel, and set the distance flown 15 miles on the outer scale against the time it took, 5.75 minutes on the inner scale. The distance to go is 67 minus 15 or 52 miles. So we read off the time remaining 20 minutes opposite 52 miles on the outer scale. In 2007, a game changer arrived. ForeFlight came out with an app that ran on an iPad and showed your GPS position overlaid on an electronic version of the paper aeronautical chart. This shows us exactly where we are. We touch the flight plan tab and it says we have 52 miles to run and that it will take us 20 minutes. So the old and the new methods agree. There's no longer any excuse for being temporarily uncertain of your position, as long as the tablet's battery holds out. Although tablets have been with us for some time, the flight training industry is still teaching navigation the old way, using a paper chart and reference to features on the ground. Perhaps this is because if they started teaching using an app, Transport Canada would be demonstrating preference for a particular commercial product, since each app is different. However, the fact is, pilots now navigate using an app and a tablet. This video is an attempt to provide newly qualified VFR pilots with the skills they need to do this. Hi there, my name's Alan Hepburn, and today we're going to talk about an aspect of flight training that the flight schools don't seem to address: navigation using 21st century tools. I'm an independent flight instructor whose most recent paper chart is probably 10 years old. In my experience, just about everybody navigates these days using a tablet with one of the common air navigation apps loaded on it. I've been wondering lately how the flight training industry is teaching the pilot navigation exercise. When I renewed my instructor rating recently, I asked my examiner how they're doing it. The answer appears to be the same as it was taught in the 20th century, with a paper chart, pencil, ruler, protractor, and an E6B whiz wheel. Maybe that shouldn't have come as a big surprise. After all, the written exam is still based on paper charts, and the objective of flight training is to pass the written exam and the flight test, not necessarily to learn how to actually fly an airplane in the 21st century. The newly qualified pilot is then left on his own to bring his navigation skills up to date. I hope you'll find this video gives you some useful pointers. For little airplanes, airframe and engine technology has been virtually unchanged for more than 50 years. But navigation has undergone several profound changes since the introduction of GPS in the mid-90s. As far as paper charts are concerned, the game changer came in 2007 when ForeFlight introduced electronic charts on the iPad. Initially, the only charts available were for the US, but coverage was soon expanded to include Canada. Let's get one thing straight. electronic charts meet the requirements of the Canadian air regulations. For a day VFR flight, you're apparently legal without any charts at all. Even for night and IFR, they say nothing about electronic versus paper charts, so we can take it that electronic charts derived from the official paper ones are legal. Nowadays, there are several apps which provide electronic charts showing the aircraft's GPS position. ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot and Flightplan.com's Go app are probably the most common. I'll be using the Go app because it's free, which is a big attraction for a Scotsman like me. The others are subscription based, so presumably they are at least as capable as the freebie. Learning the details of how to use an app and downloading the charts takes some effort, so you don't want to have to deal with more than one. Flightplan.com actually existed long before the competition, but it was strictly a flight planning website. There was no in-cockpit component. The app still interfaces with this website. When you push the Save and File button, you are taken to the website, which requires you to have an internet connection. You have to create a user account to get your logon credentials, and before you can actually file a flight plan, you have to give them written permission to do so on your behalf. But the price of all this is right. The apps are available for iOS and Android devices. Once you've got the app installed, you have to download the charts and publications, to quote the regs, for the area in which you intend to fly. Today we're going to be looking at a VFR flight from Pembroke CYTA to Gatineau CYND. For that we'll need the Toronto VFR navigation chart and the Ottawa Terminal Area Chart, or TAC. To download the VNC, you go to the Download tab. Touch Maps, Canadian Sectionals, zoom in till you can see the Toronto sectional, and touch it, and its download is underway, so touch Close. To get the VFR Terminal Area Chart, you select TAC Charts, Canada, zoom in until you see the Ottawa VTA and touch it, and close that window. You need the Terminal Area Chart wherever there is one, as the Canadian sectionals do not show important information about the airspace and airports in areas where there is a Terminal Area Chart. For reasons that I'll explain later, it's also a good idea to have the low-level IFR chart available. So touch Victor Low, Canada, zoom in to see the LO6 chart, touch it, and its download is underway. It'll take a few seconds for these downloads to complete. You're also going to need the Canada Flight Supplement, the CFS, which is available under Download, AFD and CFS. That gives you the individual entries for each airport in Section B of the Canada Flight Supplement. Then you'll want some other sections of the same document. These are available under Download, Documents, select CFS General, and that gives you Section A of the Canada Flight Supplement. Then go to CFS Ontario VFR Terminal Procedures, and since Gatineau's on the other side of the river, the CFS Quebec VFR Terminal Procedures. Remember, you'll have to update these downloads periodically on each device on which you have the app installed. With the app installed and charts downloaded, we can go to the map page. Select Layers, make sure the United States is not checked. This ensures that you're not looking at the US chart, which takes precedence if both countries are selected. Then select TACs for Terminal Area Charts and tap to hide. This will show the Terminal Area Chart in its area of coverage and the Canadian VNC elsewhere. It can be useful to have the extended runway center lines shown on the chart. So touch the settings wheel at the top left hand corner and scroll down the list to the bottom, runway airport options, and make sure that show runways on map is checked. This shows the runways at your destination airport only. That is the last waypoint on your flight plan, assuming it's a 4-letter airport ID. Now tap Edit, and we see the window where we enter our route of flight. For a typical VFR flight, this will simply be our departure and destination airport IDs, which for our Pembroke Gatineau flight will be CYTA space CYND. However, I'll digress briefly to illustrate a flight with an indirect route. Let's say our destination for the moment is North Bay. We'll enter the route CYTA CYYB. Done. And tap to hide. The direct route takes us straight through CYR 511, so that isn't going to work. What we want to do now is add a waypoint to our route to make a dogleg around the restricted airspace. The obvious option here would be to route via the Killaloe VOR, but that got decommissioned last week. The VNC hasn't been updated, but it's no longer in flightplan.com's database. How else are we to specify a turning point? Round Lake is not a recognized ICAO identifier. Flightplan.com allows you to enter waypoints in lat long format, but coming up with the numbers by reading them off the chart is laborious and error prone. Then you can drag the route by touching it lightly and moving it clear of the restricted airspace. This is called rubber banding. For some reason, rubber banding doesn't seem to work well in the air, particularly on my iPhone, so I avoid it. I'll simply click cancel for the moment. You can also enter waypoints in name radial distance format, where name is any named waypoint, not just a VOR. These waypoints are instantly translated into lat long waypoints, so this is perhaps the most reliable way to generate a lat long waypoint. However, lat long waypoints are typically not used in Canadian flight plans, other than for transoceanic routes, so avoid using them until after you have your flight plan filed. The only waypoints that will work for flight planning purposes are 4-letter airport IDs, 5-letter waypoint names, and NAVAID IDs. We'll see later, however, that generating lat long waypoints using the name/radial/distance format can be very useful after the flight plan has been filed. So we're pretty well stuck with named waypoints, most of which aren't shown on the VFR charts. We can see these best by switching to the IFR low chart, which is much easier in the electronic world than it used to be with paper charts. Just tap Layers, Victor Low, and here we see the IFR route structure around Pembroke. There's a string of named waypoints along route Tango 744 south of Pembroke. That Atona one at the left looks like a good bet for our dogleg. So let's go back to the VFR chart and enter it on our route. Layers, sectionals, tax again, edit, put the cursor before CYYB, and enter OTONA space. Done. That dogleg clearly keeps us well clear of CYR 511. Now let's change the route to CYTA CYND. Edit, clear, CYTA CYND. Then click Done and take a look at that. We'll use Zoom to Arrival to jump to the Gatineau end. You may need to zoom in a little bit manually to get it to switch from the VNC format to the terminal area chart format. There it goes. At this point, you'll see the information about the Gatineau airport and the airspace around it. If you only had the sectionals layer selected, this essential information would be absent. Now, the flight training manual says that with a paper chart, we'd prepare it by drawing the line from our departure point to our set heading point. In this case, I've picked the city of Pembroke, and then to our destination, and add 10-degree lines on either side of our course to allow us to estimate drift and distance marks every 10 miles. There's no need for this with the tablet. Once we're in the air, we simply turn towards our destination, then edit the route to be present position direct CYND. Our present position becomes our set course point. The CDI will provide us with distance off track, and the heads-up display will give us distances to our destination and to our next waypoint. The distances are the direct distances to the waypoints from our present position. We'll see later how that works. Distances can also be estimated by eyeball using the latitude ticks as a scale, or by using the ruler feature. The latter works particularly well for cumulative distances via an indirect routing. Now we should take a look at the entries for Pembroke and Gatineau in the Canada Flight Supplement. To get these, go to Airports. Enter the ident of Pembroke, CYTA. Select it and open Canada Flight Supplement. The communications block for Pembroke shows that there's an aerodrome traffic frequency of 122.8, which is a Unicom frequency. It goes out to 5 nautical miles. Gatineau is a little more complicated. Back, CYND, select, open the Canada Flight Supplement. They have a control zone around the airport, which the airport diagram shows has a 5 nautical mile radius, though the shape is irregular. There's a mandatory frequency on 122.3, controlled by Gatineau Radio. For any American viewers, by the way, there is no direct equivalent of a mandatory frequency area south of the border. As the name implies, it is mandatory to announce your intentions in these areas. They come in 2 flavors. Where the CFS lists the frequency as Unicom, you just address your transmissions to Unicom or traffic as you would at any other Unicom frequency area, mandatory or otherwise. But if it says radio, as it does at Gatineau, you should address your transmissions to Gatineau Radio. On departure, for example, you inform Gatineau Radio of your intentions before you even move. Failure to do so will get the operator slightly pissed off. The PRO section for Gatineau says, right-hand circuits runway 27. That's need-to-know stuff. Also, there's a reference to the procedures section for Ottawa International, so we better take a look at that. Back, CYOW. It turns out that the bit that matters is on the last page, where it says that you must call to get a transponder code half an hour before departing with the intention of entering Ottawa's Class C airspace. But this only applies if you don't file a flight plan, and we wouldn't dream of not doing that, would we? The other documents we need to take a look at are the VFR procedures charts for Pembroke and Gatineau, which we can find in this Canada Flight Supplement Ontario and Quebec VFR terminal procedures under binders. Here are the Ontario ones. At Pembroke, the main thing is the geographical split between Pembroke Unicom frequency and Petawawa's range control frequency, which is a mandatory frequency. If we end up using runway 35, normal departure procedures would require us to climb straight ahead to 2,000 feet before turning, but that would put us uncomfortably close to the restricted airspace around CFB Petawawa. So we'll make a turn at 500 feet above ground level. Since we're heading southeast, we might as well make it a right turn. That will avoid us having to cross the approach path of 35 later on, especially if the ceiling stops us climbing very high. At Gatineau, things get pretty messy from an airspace point of view. You can perhaps see this airspace better by switching to the Ottawa VFR terminal area chart. Note the irregular shape of the zone. Inbound from Pembroke, below 4,000, we will be in Class E airspace and should monitor the training area frequency of 123.35. Above 4, we'll be in Class C airspace and talking to Ottawa Terminal on 127.7. The Gatineau control zone has a ceiling of 2,300 feet. In it, we'll use the mandatory frequency of 122.3. On the descent into Gatineau, we may briefly be in Class E airspace near the mouth of the Gatineau River once we get below 3,000 feet. We basically have two altitude options on this flight, 5,500 and 3,500. Weather permitting, I'd rather be talking to terminal at 5,500 with traffic advisories rather than looking for training area traffic at 3,500 with no advisories. So we'll assume a cruising altitude of 5,500. Ottawa Terminal will switch us to Gatineau radio once we start our descent. We'll talk about the arrival route around the Gatineau airport later. On the return trip, we'll be routing via Arnprior, so we don't want to go all the way to 4,500 or 6,500. Also, if they're using runway 27, we will be flying straight out on the runway heading until we get around the Gatineau River, where we can avoid having to talk to terminal if we stay below 3,000 feet. So, to keep life simple, we'll plan for 2,500 on this leg. So much for arrival and departure. What information might we need en route? Well, just after we set course from Pembroke, we might want to update our departure time if we don't take off right at our flight planned time. Here's another difference for our US cousins. In Canada, our flight plan will automatically go active at our filed time off. South of the border, it has to be activated by the pilot. So we'd want to call the nearest flight service station. These facilities are shown on the VNC, but they tend to get masked by all the topographical data. They're much more obvious on the IFR chart. If we flip to it briefly, we'll see that the nearest station to Pembroke is London Radio's Foymont outlet on 122.375. Then, if we want flight following, we'd have to talk to an IFR facility. That is shown on the LO6 chart, just southeast of Pembroke, as 135.2. That's Montreal Centre. In the air, we'll be almost totally dependent on the tablet, both for accessing the charts and other publications, and for keeping track of our position on the chart. If we lose our GPS position, we'll still have the chart, so it's particularly important that we minimize the chance of the tablet itself failing. The most probable cause of such a failure is undoubtedly loss of battery power, so a means of connecting your GPS and your tablet to ship's power is essential for all but the shortest flights. Another common cause of tablet failure is overheating, so don't leave it on the glare shield. It's a good plan to have a backup for the tablet, particularly if you're flying IFR. Your cell phone is an excellent device for this, and almost all now have a GPS built in. It's quite practical to navigate using the phone's display, and most apps that run on a tablet can also run on a phone. But do make sure that the downloads are up to date and that you have an external source of power for it too. Now let's look at things that can lead to loss of the GPS signal that tells the app where to place the ownership symbol on the map. The GPS signal is extremely weak, so it's particularly vulnerable to interference. I have emails from Garmin identifying 3 possible sources. The first 2 are cell phones and onboard tracking devices like Spot. Then some of the early antennas for the Garmin 400-500 panel-mounted navigators have a failure mode where they can turn into an oscillator, which will then take out every GPS in the airplane. So set your cell phone to airplane mode, get rid of onboard trackers, and check any vintage Garmin antennas. Intentional jamming of GPS is illegal, but selling devices that jam GPS is not. Truckers have been known to buy these devices to jam the tracking devices on their trucks when they want to hide from the boss. This interference is relatively local, but there's not much you can do about it other than fly for a few miles and see if the signal comes back. Solar weather events can take out the entire system, but this is extremely rare. Some of them are predictable, and these will be no-tammed. Lastly, the military interferes with GPS from time to time. Here, for example, is a NOTAM regarding intentional interference that was in force when this presentation was being prepared. The source of this interference is in the middle of the US restricted airspace R5201, adjacent to the Wheeler-Sac Air Base in Upper New York State, and it would affect the Ottawa area at 4,000 feet above ground level. That's another reason to check NOTAMs. These NOTAMs appear almost daily in other parts of the US, but they seldom affect Canadian airspace, and I have not heard that they have a practical impact even south of the border. Apparently the airlines don't even brief their crews on these, so they may not last long enough to affect navigation. If the GPS you use as a position source for your tablet is not built in, it will communicate via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi link. In fact, I prefer a separate GPS, as I've found that I sometimes lose the built-in GPS signal when my tablet or phone is on my knee. Loss of the ownership symbol is not as serious as loss of the tablet map display, but if it persists, you're left with no alternative but to look out the window and compare what you're seeing with the map on your tablet. And the skills for this may have become a bit rusty. I've talked to pilots who complain that this happens quite frequently. If that's the case, you have some problem with the GPS tablet communication that needs to be sorted out. Loss of this link, or of the GPS signal itself, should be a very low probability event. So low, in fact, that you may elect to rely on ATC surveillance radar as your backup. However, outside of radar coverage, you're pretty well back to the 20th century and paper charts. It's still possible to buy these charts, or you can print off screenshots from your iPad if you're planning a flight outside of radar coverage. Just make sure the scale of the screenshots is big enough that you can read the essential text and see the latitude ticks. The area of coverage will have to be smaller if you're copying a terminal area chart. In Canada, we're required to file either a flight plan or a flight notification for any VFR flight going more than 25 miles from the departure point. That makes 2 differences from the way things are done south of the border. First, they have no requirement to file a VFR flight plan. Then, there's no such thing as a flight notification down there. Essentially, for a flight notification, you provide the same information as the flight plan to a responsible person who undertakes to inform search and rescue if you don't get back to him and tell him you've completed the flight safely. To file a flight plan, we start by submitting it to the flightplan.com website. You need to have an internet connection for this to work. On the VFR chart, with the Edit Route window open, click Save File. You have two options, Web or App, but the Web option allows you to change more entries from their preset default values. Select Web, and flightplan.com takes you to the website on the new flight plan page. Make sure VFR is selected. Then pick the date of flight. For now, I'll pick tomorrow, though it could be anything up to 6 months in the future. Now touch Create Flight Plan. Here we enter some data specific to the flight, such as the altitude, 5,500 instead of the default 7,500. Estimated time of departure, which for this app has to be in local time, 10 o'clock. Fuel on board is 5 hours. Souls on board 2. And click Direct for the route. Then press here for Nav Log. We're presented with a Nav Log and a box that shows the contents of most of the ICAO flight plan. This is not the full Nav Log briefing package that will be available on the Nav Log tab after we submit the flight plan. We'll talk about that shortly. Another useful feature is that you can click the ICAO flight plan listing button at the bottom left of the page, which takes you to a view of the ICAO flight plan form as it will be submitted. Back on the Nav Log, you can see that the program has calculated your flight time not just at our proposed altitude of 5,500, but at 3,500 and 7,500. It has also calculated the fuel burn, but there's very little difference between the various levels, so we'll stick with our choice for now. However, to do this, it must have had winds aloft data. Where did it get this for a flight plan which you may be submitting days ahead? It uses winds aloft forecasts available from the FAA at the time you submit your flight plan to the website. If the time of departure is within the next 18 to 24 hours, these forecasts are the ones with which we are familiar. Beyond that, there's apparently another forecast that goes out to 72 hours. After that, it uses historic data. You can see that the estimated elapsed time for plans submitted well before the departure time may be a little better than an educated guess. So, if you do submit a plan early, updating it on the day of flight will produce a more accurate estimated time en route. We can always come back and modify our plan if any up-to-date information obtained on the day of flight suggests this might be a good idea. For now, we'll simply go to the bottom of the page and click Save and Return to Main Menu. This takes us to a chronological list of flight plans, with our new one being at the bottom of the list. For every flight plan on this list, there's a Nav Log weather briefing package that is, in fact, a full briefing package for the flight. These briefings are stored on the website, but can be downloaded to your tablet. The one for the flight we just submitted may take a few seconds to be generated. When you touch the Nav Logs tab at the left of the screen, you'll see the briefing that you were last looking at. Touching the rectangle at the top of the screen will show a list headed My Nav Log/Weather, which shows briefings currently on your tablet, along with their age. You can expect these to be out of date, but they can be accessed by touching them, even if you do not have an internet connection, which will be the case when you're in the air. When you do have an internet connection, touching the refresh icon at the top right of this list will show the most recent versions available for download, and will also remove any briefing packages on your tablet for which a flight plan no longer exists on the website. For example, you can see that the briefing for the flight we just submitted is there, and it has not yet been downloaded. Touching the refresh icon for a specific flight will update it on the website. Touching the Nav Log itself will download the version displayed to your tablet, where it will replace the one you were viewing previously. So, touch that not yet downloaded briefing, and it will be brought into your tablet and will replace the one currently in view. You will be able to view it in the air after you lose your internet connection. Now you'll see what I mean by a full briefing package. It contains airport diagrams, text weather, NOTAMs. It does not, however, show much in the way of graphic forecast weather or radar. And down here there's a caveat about weather and NOTAMs for requested foreign airports perhaps being incomplete or missing. Also, of course, it only shows the information available at the time the Nav Log was generated, though in this case that was just a few seconds ago. Back at the list of flight plans, we can check the Modify button if we want to make any changes, or we can check the File button if we're ready to file the flight plan. When we've decided what, if anything, we want to do right now, we select Press Here when done. If we check Modify, we'll be taken back to the screen where we can update any of the flight plan data. If we check File, the flight plan will be filed either immediately or 2 hours ahead of the filed off time, whichever comes first. If neither box is checked, the flight plan will just stay on the list awaiting future action. Often I make the initial submission of my flight plan a day or two ahead of time. As I mentioned earlier, you can submit flight plans up to 6 months ahead, but I wouldn't recommend this, particularly for VFR. By the time we're down to a day or two, however, the civil forecast will have given me a pretty good idea of whether the flight will be feasible. Of course, you should also check the aviation weather and NOTAMs when this information becomes available, which typically won't be until the day of the flight. At that time, you may want to modify your flight plan before filing it. If nothing else, you'll probably want to resubmit your plan to get it to use up-to-date winds aloft data. Even if we have checked File, we can come back and modify the plan provided it has not yet actually been filed. On the morning of our flight, I go to the Nav Canada AWWS website and take a look at the GFA along our route. I'll pick the one for 12 Zulu, and it's showing some local half a mile in fog, ceilings 200 above ground level, tops at 1,000, mainly over Ontario. That's probably going to be early morning fog, which will burn off. We can fast forward to the 18 Zulu Forecast, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and all there is a few at 4 with tops at 6. We'll check that in a moment by looking at the TAFs on the flightplan.com Nav Log. We'll go back and take a look at the radar. Precipitation rate, Ottawa, submit, and it's severe clear. Now we'll look at our flightplan.com Nav Log. There's no TAF for Pembroke, but looking at the one for Petawawa nearby, there's some early morning mist, but it'll be burned off by 1300, and other than that, the worst is 4,000 feet scattered. They don't have a TAF for Gatineau yet, but Ottawa nearby has nothing more than some scattered cloud at 6,000. And lastly, taking a look out of the window, there's not too much sign of mist around here, so it looks like we're probably good to go this morning. There's really no concise online source of NOTAMs in Canada. They're available on the plan.navcanada.ca website, but even for a simple flight down the Ottawa Valley, they insist on giving you notices about avoiding flight in the Minsk FIR, not overflying Kabul below flight level 260, and of course reams of stuff on COVID. So I call FSS for a no-time review, just like I did in 1970. A word of caution. When I was making this video, I tried to record my conversation with the guy from London Radio. He obviously had some indication that this was going on and gave me a by-the-book briefing, which included COVID and every crane and inoperative light between here and Gatineau. So, if you want it concise, keep the recording feature turned off. So I've just checked with my buddy and it looks like we're on for a 10:15 departure. We'll go to flightplan.com. We'll touch modify on that flight plan. Press here when done. There we are, it's VFR. We'll update the flight plan. We'll make the time off 10:15. Everything else is good. Press here for a nav log, and there we are. There's no big saving to climbing, so we'll stick with our 5,500 feet. Press and return to main menu. Check the file button. Press here when done, and it says the flight plan will be filed. And a few seconds later we get the confirming email from flightplan.com. Since the flight plan has now been filed, we can make a minor change to our route at the Gatineau end. Gatineau has a mandatory frequency area, so the joining procedure is pretty well up to us, as long as we comply with that right-hand pattern when runway 27 is in use. For runway 09, we'll probably join straight in where the runway centre line intersects the Gatineau River. We'll use the name/radio/distance format to add this as a waypoint before Gatineau in our route. Looking at the chart, this intercept point would be about 8 miles out from the airport on the runway centre line. Since the runway is 09, that'll be 8 miles out on the 270 radial. Just edit the route, put the cursor after Gatineau, add /270 for the radial and 8 for the distance. Then add CYND again as our destination. And we're good to go. If we happen to be using runway 27, we'd want to turn onto a downwind heading, perhaps 2 miles earlier. In this case, there's no need to add another waypoint. We'll just turn towards the airport when we still have about 2 miles to run to the final intercept, then continue to join straight in to the right-hand downwind for 27. The HUD will tell us when we're 2 miles back from the intercept point. Since we'll be using this iPad for in-flight navigation shortly, we should set up the course deviation indicator, the own ship symbol, and perhaps the breadcrumbs, which will show us the track we've flown. These three are on the settings menu. Ship position, course deviation indicator, and breadcrumbs. We will also need to know the distances to our next waypoint and to our destination. These will be on the HUD, which is enabled by dragging the symbol at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen to the left. And there's the HUD. I should perhaps mention something about the altitude displayed by the HUD, by the way. It shows the altitude received from the WASP GPS in my Lynx transponder. But the Lynx is sending something called the height above the ellipsoid, which doesn't mean much to most pilots. In the area where this video is being taken, the ellipsoid is about 100 feet above the sea level reference, so these altitudes look about 100 feet low. So let's go out to the airplane and see how this all works out.